I'm going to talk to you a little bit today at the very beginning of our philosophy class about the mythological worldview. And if you're hearing this title, you're kind of thinking, mythological worldview? What? Right? It's kind of strange. It's not a concept you're familiar with, but you've all heard of myths, right? You've all heard of Superman myths or Batman myths, or maybe even Hercules myths or Achilles or any of those old ancient Greek or Roman myths. Everybody's heard about them. And so I'm going to be talking about the mythological worldview today. And in case you're still struggling a little bit about the concept, let me compare it with something that might be more familiar to you, the scientific worldview. So if you have a scientific worldview, what would that imply? If you have a scientific worldview, you tend to look at natural phenomenon, at things that are going on Earth and in space and in the cosmos. You tend to see them as natural phenomenon. For instance, if you all experience something like this in the next few minutes. Okay, that's my little simulation of an earthquake. If you had a scientific worldview, you could basically say, oh, that's plate tectonics. Some of you have watched, the History Channel or Natural Sciences Channel or something like that. Earth Week. And you're probably aware that, the Earth sits on these big plates that are grinding underneath about 40 miles underneath the Earth's crust. These plates are kind of shifting and grinding on each other. There's the Pacific plate, there's the North American plate, the South American plate. There's all kinds of plates that are kind of just jostling for position underneath the Earth's crust. That's called plate tectonics. They're always shifting and moving, and wherever they collide, there's a chance a volcano can emerge. Okay, that's way too much information, but if you have a scientific worldview, you tend to look at things like that. Now, if you were living in the ancient world, anywhere where it was a kind of a pre-scientific society, how would they look at something like that? Do you think the village elder would stand up and say, oh, everybody just relax a little bit. It's nothing but plate tectonics. The earth is releasing geothermal pressure, and it's a natural phenomenon, and it will pass in a few minutes. Do you think that somebody from a pre-scientific society would get up and explain to the village people that that's what was happening? Hell no. They would probably say, oh no, the gods are angry. The gods certainly wouldn't be very happy, not if the earth was shaking and there was ground ruptures appearing here and there. That wouldn't be that the gods were happy. They would explain things in terms of God. Okay, so if you believe in a scientific worldview, now that the earth, in the last 20 years has gotten hotter and hotter and hotter, I'm sure even this summer will be hot, you would tend to look at that as not that the gods are angry, but that human beings are producing a lot of fossil fuel waste, a lot of CO2 burning. They get CO2 emissions that get trapped in the atmosphere, and it creates a greenhouse effect. So once you have all this smoke and all these byproducts that are burned as a result of fossil fuels, coal and gasoline and petroleum and oil, once those fossil fuels are burned, one of the byproducts of that combustion process is CO2. Well, the CO2 goes up in the atmosphere and it then gets trapped in the atmosphere. So when the sun's layers comes through the CO2, it stays in and then it cannot bounce back out. That's called the greenhouse effect. It's like what happens when your car is sitting in the parking lot out in the sun. The sun's rays can come in, but then they get trapped by the windows. And that's what our atmosphere is doing right now. Okay, way too much information, right? The scientific worldview. But what's the mythological worldview? Well, that's the condition that human beings were in before science and certainly before philosophy. What would human beings do as they were sitting around campfires, as they were sitting around huts or little primitive dwellings, and they were looking up at a night sky that had way more stars in it than we can see now because we have so much optic, contamination. There's so much light now because of artificial sources that we can't really see this guy. If you ever go up to Julian at night, or if you go up into Mount Laguna on a beautiful cold winter night, you see so many more stars. We can't see that anymore. What do you think the heavens look like? Even 5 or 6 or 1,000 or 2 or 3,000 or 8,000 years ago. What do you think the night sky looked like? It must have just been littered with stars, just twinkling stars everywhere. And that must have been an incredible natural phenomenon for primitive people to look at. People would have been much more in tune with nature, with the migrations of animals, with fish, being plentiful. Human beings would have been fascinated by the natural world, and yet they were kind of living in a world of mystery. Even though they were starting to learn how to maybe hunt and harvest, there were many things outside of the control of human beings. For instance, life and death and tragedy and suffering. People would have been wondering, even way back in the day, what were the origins to nature and creation? Why is there suffering? Is there a God? Are there several gods? Why do people hate? Why do people have evil within them? Why are people so proud? Why do people fall in love? Why does a child die when it's a baby, and that it brings in this unexplainable suffering to a young couple? Human beings way back in the day, just like now, would be experiencing life, and not only experiencing life, but experiencing the mystery of life. And so that would make human beings begin to ponder their existence. They didn't have access to technology. They couldn't look through a telescope. They didn't have this mathematical understanding to be able to see the workings of nature. All they could do was experience nature, and they certainly experienced love, strife, warfare, famine. Let's just say the crops are not growing. Do you think that they would be able to say, I think that there's a nitrogen and phosphorus deficiency in the soil? They wouldn't have been able to say that. They wouldn't have been able to have primitive understandings. They would have had only primitive understandings of natural phenomena such as growing. Although they probably knew how to grow things fantastically well, but they certainly didn't know about the chemical things that were going on within the earth. So human beings found themselves in the presence of mystery. And so what did that do? It led to the formulation of myth. And so what is the mythological worldview? That's a kind of a worldview that begins when human beings are faced with the natural mystery that's in life: birth, death, life, creation, goodness, evil, hatred, love, natural calamities and tragedies, a tsunami, a rainbow, an earthquake, a tornado, or volcano. What do you think that these things would do to impact human beings who don't really have a scientific worldview? They still are impactful for human beings now. When we have a virus, a lot of people will be saying it's the end of the world. So it's interesting that human beings, even though we are much more modern and we have much more science, on some level, we always are this very frightened creature, afraid of the dark, afraid of the unknown, afraid of death, and full of questions, full of wonder, and full of speculation. We don't know what's going on. So it's natural for human beings to try to figure out, how do I explain the mystery of life? And so human beings at some point began to develop myths, stories, fables, to try to help them experience and process life, natural phenomenon, and things like that. And one of the really big authors in the field of world mythology is somebody called Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book. It's kind of an interesting title. I've had it for years. It's called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. I hope you guys can see this. And in this book, Campbell talks about the hero's journey. And he says that just about in every culture of the world, there is some kind of hero myth in which somebody from a tribe will go off from their tribe on an experience to try to bring back some sacred message for the rest of the tribe. He's got to go find out how to find fire. He's got to go try to have a confrontation with the god of death. He's got to try to bring back some message, but he has to take a journey to try to figure out something. It's called the hero's journey. And that's why Campbell calls this story the hero of a thousand faces, because he'll say that whether you're talking about Greeks or Romans or Persians or Babylonians or Japanese or Nordic people that have all kinds of Viking myths, or if you're talking about island people, uh, myths are developed all over the world, from Asia to Africa to the North American or the South American continents. People always will produce myths, and it's usually some kind of fable, either a creation story or in the story of a hero. The hero has to go and confront something and bring back some sacred information that allows the rest of the people to kind of understand some important insight that they need. Hollywood still contributes myths all the time. If you see a movie like Avatar, or if you see a movie like, well, several movies, Star Wars. Star Wars is modern myth making. I mean, that story could have been, like George Lucas, could have been created. Of course, it has too much science, but it's basically people thinking about the journey of the hero. Luke Skywalker is the hero, and he's got to try to figure out who he is and how to save himself and how to save the universe from evil, from Darth Vader. He's got to confront his father. Many of us have to confront our parents. That's part of our hero's journey. And that's why these stories, whether they're told around an ancient campfire or whether they're told through Netflix or through a movie, through electronic images, they are still trying to deal with fundamental things that we can't quite figure out. Birth, death, dying, suffering, our origins, our destiny. We can't figure them out. And I'd like to read some lines for you from Campbell's book that I think are fascinating. Campbell studied all the world myths, whether he was talking about Hawaiian myths, Aztec myths, Mayan myths, or whether he was talking about myths from the Anglo-Saxon world, from Ireland or from England or from Germany. He was a true student, and North American, Indian, Eskimo. He studied myths from all over the world, and including African, Chinese. He wasn't exclusive like with a European worldview. And he really had a lot of psychoanalytic background, especially from Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Listen to his words, and I'll let you see them so that you're not just hearing them as an audio image, because he's a brilliant writer. So listen to this. He'll say, and this is from the Hero with a Thousand Faces. The unconscious sends all sorts of vapors, odd beings, terrors, and deluding images from the unconscious into the mind, whether in dream or in broad daylight or in insanity. For the human kingdom, he's saying, for the human kingdom beneath the floor of the comparatively neat little dwelling that we call our consciousness goes down into unsuspected Aladdin caves. In those caves, not only jewels can be found, but also dangerous beings. The inconvenient or resisted psychological powers that we have not thought or dared to integrate into our lives. And they may remain unsuspected, or on the other hand, some chance word, the smell of a landscape, the taste of a cup of tea, or the glance of an eye may touch a magic spring, and then dangerous messengers begin to appear in the brain. These are dangerous because they threaten the fabric of the security into which we have built ourselves and our family. But they are fiendishly fascinating too, for they carry keys that open the whole realm of the desired and feared adventure of the discovery of the self, destruction of the world that we have built and in which we live, and of ourselves within it. But when a wonderful reconstruction, the bolder, the cleaner, more spacious, and fully human life, that is the lure, the promise, and terror of these disturbing night visitants from the mythological realm that we carry within. So that's kind of wordy, and I'm hoping that the transcription of the text will help you see what's going on. But Campbell is aware that underneath this surface of our face and these clothes and this house that we've constructed and the roads that we drive on and the schools that we edify and the families that we create, underneath all these little creations, of society and home and family and marriage, underneath that, we have a very active unconscious brain that can be stimulated by some smell or a memory, and all of a sudden something that we've been dreaming about, something in our unconscious, could come out and make us realize that there's something that we have to do with our lives. We're not aware of it on our conscious level, but suddenly it's some little thing that we experience in the world can make us aware of something that maybe we're repressing or something that we're not in contact with. Welcome to the world of the unconscious. Welcome to the world which is the base and origin of myths, because myths are created from these dreams that human beings have all over the world that are dealing with very unconscious forces that we oftentimes are not in control of, but yet these unconscious forces are dealing with very, very powerful things within human beings, like birth and death, and what is my meaning, and what is my life, and is there a God? Let me just make this a little bit personal, but about 3 days ago, I swear to you, it was really hot. It's starting to get summer. I dreamed that I was let out of some kind of prison, or I was being kept in captivity. And then when I came out of the captivity, I was allowed to get into a glider plane. I don't know if you guys ever seen a glider plane. I'll populate it with an image. They pull it behind a car, and the glider just it has no engine. It just kind of takes off into the sky. And so I remember being pulled by this truck, sent up a kind of a hill, like an incline, and all of a sudden I was off into the space, into the air, and I was gliding. But then my brain metamorphosed into the fact that I was outside of the cockpit, and now I was flying. Kind of like Superman, kind of like Superman does his like Superman flying gesture. I was flying, but I was also embracing a tiger, a white tiger, which was kind of interesting because I could feel its muscles. I could feel the air rippling through its little fur, and I could feel its musculature, and I was kind of holding it around its backside and flying with my one arm attached to a tiger, flying through the air. But I wasn't afraid, even though I was aware that it was a fierce beast. But I was comfortable with it, and we're flying through the air, and a part of me is also on the ground looking up at this site. So not only am I flying, I'm down below on the earth looking up at this site. And it's really amazing. So we're flying through the air, and then we crash into a tree. We come down through all these branches and leaves, and boom, we find ourselves at the bottom of the tree after we've crashed into the tree. And we're kind of dusting ourselves off full of branches and leaves, and now this tiger and I are looking at each other at the base of a tree. What the hell? What is that? Well, a Jungian psychoanalyst would have a field day with that. He says, well, you need to embrace the tiger. What does the tiger represent? Well, this is what Homer was doing back in the day when he was coming up with things like the one-eyed Cyclops, or when he was thinking about Odysseus having to get back to his home in Greece to go back to his wife, which he had left 10 years before to go fight in the war, the Trojan War. He had joined Achilles to go get back Helen of Troy, who had run away with Paris, to live behind the walls of Troy. So Odysseus on the way back has many, many journeys to try to get back to his wife Penelope, and one of them is to try to, get past the sirens. The sirens are like singing mermaids who are, with this beautiful song, kind of luring him closer and closer. But he tells his sailors, tie me to the mast so that I don't do something crazy to leave my hero's quest and to go run off with them while I'm waiting for while my faithful wife Penelope is waiting for me to come back home. That's an incredible story of like, and that's not only, I don't want to just like, it's not, I don't want to turn this into like the male being tempted by the female impression. That's kind of a one interpretation, but I think it's anybody's temptation, whether male or female, that when you're on the way back to find yourself, you and I are going to have to deal with certain turns in the road that might take us away from the path that we need to be on, from the path of loyalty and fidelity, and that we might get disturbed from that path and never make it back home to the place that's calling us. Penelope represents the soul that we have now come back after all this stuff. When you tell your parents, I'm going to move out, I'm tired of you being under the, and you go through all these changes, then later on when you start to see your parents maybe as your friend again, you realize, wow, I had to go through so many things, I had to come back home. Even the Wizard of Oz, Dorothy, after all this tormenting big hurricane, or excuse me, a tornado that kind of whips through Kansas, what is that but all this stuff that happens in our life? Think about the Wizard of Oz as kind of like another thing. She's got to go through witches. She's got to go through all kinds of illusions. She has to meet people that need to find their heart, their courage. They need to find strength. They need to find all these things symbolized by the scarecrow and the cowardly lion and the Tin Man. All of those things, it is another modern adaptation of a myth in which human beings have to try to find the meaning to this process or this experience called life, which is often really, really mysterious. And all the science in the world, all the scientific worldview in the world is never going to give us those answers that often appear to us at night and in our dreams. I want you to also link, or after you close down this video, see the little link in this same first week module, which is entitled The Sacred Gathering, a little excerpt from YouTube from the movie by Mel Gibson before he went kind of crazy and went off the rails, and he made Apocalypto. It's a great little story about this gathering of this Mayan tribe sitting around and talking about this myth of the man who's talking with animals. I want you to look at that and keep this lecture in mind, that little story from that movie, which is a great movie. It's a little bit beyond you guys right now. It's maybe 11 or 12 years old, and you guys probably have not seen that movie now. Your parents did. But check it out and stuff like that, because it's a really wonderful example of a human being or a culture, the Mayan culture, I don't know if it's true or not, creating a myth to deal with the fact that human beings have this empty hole inside that oftentimes human beings can't see. And no matter what we do, we can't fill up this hole, even though we destroy the whole world trying to do it. All right, bye.